this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Got a great episode today. We're talking about the economics of cities and a whole lot of other things. Infrastructure, housing, what millennials have to complain about, what they don't have to complain about, the economics of cities as it relates to pandemics. Heck, we're going to talk about why cities even exist in the first place. And to help us with that conversation, I have Dr. Ed Glaeser, Ed Glaeser here with us. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a professor of economics at Harvard University. He has taught there since 1992. Ed, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. So
at Harvard, are you an undergrad professor, or do you do postgrad also?
I teach in our PhD program. I teach undergraduates, and for 10 years, I was also directed two research centers over at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Center for State and Local Government and the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. Yeah,
so when I was at HKS, I took the class on city innovation. It was pretty interesting. You didn't teach the class, but I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about, where we integrate with the different cities within the Boston area. Mine was my project was Winthrop, and we have to do sort of a whole public policy project on that.
That was with Linda Bilmes? Or Steve Goldsmith?
No, you caught me flat-footed. It was I shouldn't have brought it up if I can't remember which professor taught it. Let's move on.
But it was great.
It was great. I had a lot of fun.
It's fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, it was great. No, one of my favorite classes at Harvard, economics classes, was with Marty Feldstein. That was and may he rest in peace. Phenomenal.
Marty was a very great man, and I miss him a great deal.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. Just a giant of the economics profession, and miss him very much. So with that, but your focus is on microeconomics and urban and city economics. And so I kind of want to just start with this sort of general existential question, which is this: why do cities even exist? I mean, it's not obvious to me that human beings should congregate in these crowded, messy cities. We plenty of human beings like to be out in the country or promote their civilizations in a tribe-like fashion and live in the forest, whatever. There's lots of different ways to live, and yet our main civilization seems to congregate in the cities. What is the psychology behind that? What is the sociological reasoning behind doing that?
Of course, for most of human existence, we didn't urbanize. For most of human existence, we spread ourselves out, mostly because you can't create cities unless you have enough surplus agriculture so that people don't need to gather for themselves. But for most of the last 2,000 years, we have been on this path of becoming increasingly urban. And I think that's because there's something about cities that's fundamentally human. If you think about us as a species, all of us on our own, we're all pretty feeble. None of us could really take down a bear without help from somebody else.
Speak for yourself, okay? No, but you're right.
I'm sure
you're
you're
right.
a lot tougher than I am.
But not tougher than a bear.
and to take down the bear, you're going to be using something that's been made by somebody else, right? You're presumably taking a weapon or some other thing that you haven't made yourself. And so it's really collaboration that's the hallmark of humanity. And cities make it easier to collaborate. They make it easier to buy and sell, to learn from each other, to collectively produce stuff. And I just want to make this clear from the start, right? While I see lots of upsides in the cities, there are also plenty of downsides. And I think a glorious thing about America is that we have lots of different ways that you can live. And some people want to live in a crowded New York apartment, and some people want to live out in Idaho, and it's all good. It's just a great nation has opportunities for people to live in different ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's different ways to connect with each other, and like you said, there's pros and cons. As it relates to a pandemic, how do you think? obviously, I think it's self-evident that it's not surprising, at least, that New York City is the center of the pandemic right now. It's by far, it has the highest density in America. People has a ton of public transportation, and so the spread of something like a virus was wholly expected. And we're seeing a lot less of that spread in a place like Houston, even though fourth largest city in America, but we don't really take public transportation to the same extent that New Yorkers do. We don't have nearly the same density. So maybe going forward, as we look while also looking into the past, how should cities be dealing with pandemics, and how have they dealt with pandemics, and what can we learn from this one?
You know, urban density has many positive aspects to it, and that's, if two people are close enough to communicate an idea face to face, they're also close enough to communicate a virus. And for at least 2,400 years, since the plague of Athens slew Pericles and deeply troubled Athens during the Peloponnesian War, cities have been dealing with the terrible downside of contagious disease. And there's no question that, proximity is how this thing spreads. There's a debate about the relative role of public transportation. That data is currently unclear. What we know is that actually the positive rates per capita across New York City zip codes are actually lower in zip codes when there's more public transportation usage, but that the rates of hospitalization for flu-like symptoms are higher in areas with more public transportation. So I'm still unclear on that. But the basic point that cities enable disease to spread is just obviously true. And it's been obviously true, throughout almost all of history. It's just we've lived through this incredibly fortunate century since the influenza pandemic of 1919 to 1921, where cities have just seemed unbelievably safe, and they have been. But this is in some sense a reminder of the fact that historically, a boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than a boy born in rural America. Right, that was a huge gap, and it's sort of amazing that during this, all of the 19th century, where cities were often killing fields, that people would still come to cities despite the fact that they were so deadly.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And let's talk about the city's role in battling a pandemic. I mean, that's been the subject of much debate recently, mostly along the lines of simply blaming each other. And that's just the unfortunate reality. But if you're on one side of that debate, you're like, hey, you're a city barely making it, and it's always up to the federal government to come swoop in and save you, and it should always be up to the federal government to prepare for everything. And if you're on the other side of that debate, well, you might say, actually, that's not how it works. The federal government certainly has a role, but it can't possibly be the primary role. And the management of a pandemic and the management of preparing for that pandemic, it still has to occur at the local level. And I think you've seen different cities manage that differently. And so, what's the history of it? How if politics weren't a part of this, and it was this was a bit more of a technocratic conversation, what do you think the most efficient way to prepare is?
So historically, remember this in 1900, America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sewers as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And it's certainly true if you went back to the America of McKinley or even of Teddy Roosevelt, the idea that, somehow they're dealing with local disease was the federal government's job would have been laughable, just because this was so much money. And indeed, this is one of the amazing things that happened in the 19th century, was that cities and towns stepped up to the plate. They built this amazing infrastructure for dealing with the waterborne plagues. And you didn't need that as much in lower density America, where it was just fine to have septic tanks. But in cities, there's no replacement for having the aqueducts and the pipes that would get rid of the muck. And that's pretty much what eliminated the cholera risk, the various waterborne plagues that were terrible in the 19th century. It was mostly urban regulation that got rid of the animals who were responsible for the animal-borne plague. So the fleas, the mosquitoes draining the swamps, that again was largely local, although there were some federal parts in this. Now, we've of course been hit with a droplet carried plague, and it was always obvious that was going to be the one that was hardest to get rid of, right? Anytime two human beings interact, they have some possibility of transmitting this thing. And that's what's really hard. Now, I agree with you that there's a whole bunch of preparedness. I mean, it's easy to this is a situation which it's easy to basically throw blame on everyone because everyone is to blame, including me, right? Including all of us who didn't worry enough about this, especially since we did have warnings from SARS and everything else. So let's just admit that we're all to blame to begin with, and now focus on how to make things better going forward. And I think in terms of cities, it's mostly about sort of preparing with local capacity. And making sure that you know what you're going to be doing once it happens. I think there's a certain sense in which the medical research, the rules about doing new vaccine development, maybe even the presence of sort of a national ventilator bank, that's something that maybe the federal government could play a role on. But certainly in terms of the rules about, let's say, when you're opening up, you really want this to be something that has some respect for local conditions. The idea that you want to have sort of a national policy on lockdown seems like a very hard thing when just the death rates just look nothing like each other. I mean, in different parts of the country.
Well, I just found it hysterical that, a lot of people in the media would be pressuring the president to do a national lockdown. And he toyed with that idea. And then people like me would say, no, absolutely not. Do not do that. And they talked about some kind of federal involvement in New York and New Jersey at some point, and those state governments resisted the idea, rightfully so. But the hysterical part was that a couple of weeks later, the president talks about a national reopening, and everybody's like, "You don't have the power to do that." It's like,
that's right.
Wait.
You still don't. You didn't have before, and you don't have
it now.
That's
Our fair weather federalists, as we would call them.
That's right. But I do think, but you don't want every city to try and be handling its own medical research institute. Right, of course. Right? I mean, you do want.
Yeah, and that's the conversation that, I would. This is certainly an opportunity for America to kind of remember what the role of federal government is, and I wonder if it's a time to step back and say, wow, like as you said, everybody was underprepared. The national stockpile was depleted back in 2009 on N95 masks in particular. There's been, people don't realize this, there's actually been quite a bit of additional pandemic preparedness spending over the last 5 years. But we didn't try to make a vaccine quickly enough for corona. We've known about coronaviruses for a while and probably could have done more there, like you said, based on our experience with SARS in the past. And it gets to this question: does the federal government need to start focusing on these true externalities that require a national response, like any kind of disaster preparedness, like a military, and be really, really good at that stuff, as opposed to trying to do literally everything else? Because I'm in Congress, as it turns out, and I know what we vote on. And it is often micro policy, and then there is always this question, and the conservatives are the ones who especially ask this, which is, why are we solving this in Congress? And again, and then day after day after day, why is it up to us to solve this? Why can't this be solved by either the people themselves at a community level, or by the local government, or by the state government? And we've forgotten how to have that conversation as a country, in my opinion. And I see it from our local officials too. I mean, local officials, they actually, I think, act helpless. They're so much more helpless than they really are. And it's a trend, it seems like. But you've been around a lot longer than me, and you've been studying this a lot longer than I have.
So let me remind you of Ford the City dropped dead in the 1970s. So I
wasn't around, so this is why I asked you.
You were not around for it. But New York had, there was both the sort of deindustrialization, which hit all of America's older, colder cities, right? I mean, it's easy to forget now, but in 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to turn off the lights. Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller GM, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing, and Boeing had been cutting back on jobs. So all of these older cities looked like they were in trouble. All of them had social problems, massively rising crime rates, and some of them, like New York, had really mismanaged their books. And so, they were facing some sort of short-term insolvency. And, they show up in Washington asking for a bailout. And I've talked to people who are actually part of the budget team and part of Ford administration, and they didn't actually say drop dead or anything like it. But they did say, look, there are certain conditions for getting money. You're actually going to have to put in some reasonable fiscal standards. And they walked away from it, and New York eventually, under the aegis of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, Felix Rohatyn, they actually pulled their act together and ended up being a better run city as a result of it. There's a lot to like about city governments having to get their own houses in order without federal bailouts. Now, there's a tricky part of this, which is one of the reasons why they're going to be asking for federal cash, is because they're not set up to borrow. Okay, and that's actually part of this kind of an attractive fiscal discipline about that we don't really like states and local governments borrowing to spend on the current account. But I think in some basic way, it's healthier for them to borrow in response to a pandemic than for expect people in Iowa to bail them out. And so we need to sort of have a national conversation, which is New York is not now on the where it was in 1975. The economy was prior to 2 months ago dynamic, strong, lots of cash flowing through the city. There's no reason why it couldn't afford to deal with its own bills. I think by and large, we need to figure out a way so that it can pay for the COVID crisis, but can do so in a way that is responsible, that keeps its own, act together, and that doesn't ask everyone everywhere to pay for its needs.
Yeah, and during a COVID-19 crisis, I think it's entirely understandable that some local and state expenses could be reimbursed. I just think more generally, I wonder if we've gotten away far. We as a culture, this is a cultural issue where we've decided that there's only one government, and that's the federal government, and as opposed to trusting our local officials to handle problems and to finance the solutions to those problems more effectively.
In the 10 years that I directed the Towman Center for State and Local Government, I would remind Kennedy School students over and over again that the levels of government that provide the services that matter most at the individual level, the schools that educate our kids, the streets that we drive on, the safety that we rely on, all that's done by state and local government. One of the facts that I love, it's a fact associated with Joe Jerko and Fernando Ferreira at Wharton, which is if you just look at Democratic mayors who win by 51% or Republican mayors who win by 51%, they look identical, right? Mm-hmm. It's this point that there's no Republican or Democratic way to clean up a street or take out the snow. And they're very pragmatic people. And because they're handling real problems on the ground, and it just feels very different than Washington, where does it matter if you're the Republican guy who's won by 51% or the Democratic guy who's won by 50%? You bet it does. It matters a huge amount. And so that pragmatism is kind of deeply likable. And I think the more that you think that we have real problems in this world, like pandemics, the more important it is to have a federal government that has more of that spirit. That is more of the spirit of saying, look, this is not a question for ideology. This is a question of how it is that we're going to make America safe to make sure nothing like this ever happens again.
Yeah, there's something to be said for that, which is why I brought it up. I wonder if this is an awakening for federal government where we should really just be focusing on the things that only a federal government could possibly do. Disaster response being one of those things, a military being one of those things. There's a reason that we divide up responsibilities accordingly, and I just think that over time, it seems that every single small issue all of a sudden got delegated to Congress. When people are coming to me about the potholes, I think we've forgotten our civics lessons and who should do what and who should have responsibility for what. It is and I agree with you that at the local level, that ideology of left versus right, it should matter quite a bit less. I think there's probably still a little bit there, and we're actually seeing that play out now during the COVID-19 crisis. You're seeing some cities implement very draconian measures, and others not so much, and that not entirely, but for the most part, that seems to be strictly along partisan lines. Republicans are just generally more likely to say, hey, personal responsibility matters, and we expect you to live that way, but we're not going to make you live that way. And the left doesn't see it that way. And I think that bears out in the current policies. But I would say
that's probably right. Although I think that as much reflects the preferences of the voters relative to the elected officials. So, for example, we have a Republican governor here in Massachusetts, who I'm quite fond of, Charlie Baker, and Charlie is going to be as strong on lockdowns as anyone in the country, because that's what his voters are going to want. Yeah. So it's but I agree with you. It's about there are differences of ideology which go with these desire for lockdowns.
Yeah, and on the spectrum of Republicans, I'm sure me and Charlie Baker are pretty far apart. But But to your point about where ideology matters, I would agree with that. Again, I think it matters a lot less at the local level. It matters a little bit more at the state level. I still think it matters quite a bit at the federal level, because that ideology mostly manifests in how the federal government should be structured, why government exists in the first place, and the framework with which we solve problems. Again, the question I asked a little bit ago, which is, should we even be solving this problem? Like, should we even be solving it? I mean, as a congressman, I should really be asking that often. But I'll tell you what, my Democrat colleagues don't ask that question. They always think that Congress should solve the problem. Like 100% of the time, there should be a new program to solve the problem. I promise you this is true. I don't think that. And that's an ideological difference. That's a difference of principles about how we should govern. And so it matters at the federal level.
I agree. And I think that those conversations about what the government should do are important. I do think that we perhaps spend too much time on that, and I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but we may spend too much time on that relative to how is it that we are going to actually get the things that the government should do as good as they can possibly be.
Yeah.
Right. So how is it that we can make our military as effective as it can possibly be in protecting America and her interests? How is it that we can make sure that we have a pandemic policy that's really great going forward? Which shouldn't be an ideological question, although I agree the question of whether or not, the federal government is responsible for everything is an ideological question, and there's no escaping that.
Yeah, and I hope we have a great nonpartisan lessons learned on pandemic response after this. It's hard to imagine anything nonpartisan these days, unfortunately, even as something as obvious as how pandemic response should look in the future. But we shall see anyway. So let's go back to the economics of cities for a minute. You have a term called agglomeration economies. Is that play into what I asked about before on why cities exist in the first place?
Absolutely. Okay. Agglomeration economies is just a fancy way of saying that we become more productive when we are next to each other, when we're close to each other. It's generally thought that agglomeration economies come from the reduction of transportation costs, come from the fact that it's easier to move stuff around when we're close. But typically we try to interpret those agglomeration economies as being about reducing the transportation costs for goods, for moving, oil over space, for people, for the ability for individuals to go and provide services for each other, and for ideas. And indeed, certainly when you think about what cities have done over the past 2,500 years, the creation of these sort of collaborative chains of creativity, which have powered humanity's greatest hits from Athenian philosophy to Facebook, that's the biggest thing, right? And I see, for millennia, amazing things have been happening when people learn from each other in dense clusters. And the age of urban miracles is still with us. I mean, amazing things are happening all the time when people are able to learn from one another. And I think in this current moment of Zoom, we still have yet to know whether or not video conferencing will be able to replicate that. But, when you think about the sort of middle one, the transportation costs for people, that's sort of an issue which is really rife in the current COVID pandemic, right? Because in fact, what social distancing is about increasing the distance between people. It's about fundamentally de-urbanizing. Mm-hmm. And the occupations that those have, been roughest on are the urban service workers, right? The 32 million Americans who work in hospitality, leisure, retail, trade. And when you think about the sort of long arc of American employment history, we've moved first from farms to factories, and then we moved from factories to we're an overwhelmingly service economy in this country. And for many of the less privileged Americans, those are services where they're earning their living by doing something, bringing pleasure to other people around them by serving them a smile with their cup of coffee, and that the value of that smile has not been eroded by automation. I mean, you can a machine can make you your cappuccino, but they can't tell you look good this morning while they're serving it to you. But those jobs are also the ones that are completely on the front line of the pandemic, and it's those workers and it's the future of that kind of work that I really worry about.
Yeah, I don't want to get your take on what we're doing to alleviate that. Do you think who's going to have a harder time recovering, rural communities or the urban communities, or both?
Okay, so let's separate this out. So I'm very big that it's a foolish thing to think. It's a foolish thing to group America into too big an area anyway. There are a million microcosms in this amazing country. But like the view of America as being like coastal states and flyover states is particularly nonsense. In part because there's a big difference between this swath of America that I've tended to call the Eastern Heartland, which starts down with Louisiana and Mississippi and then runs up through Appalachia and ends in the Rust Belt cities, versus the Western Heartland, which in my taxonomy includes Texas and includes basically all of the Great West. And before this thing started, I would have said that, in terms of particularly American joblessness, particularly prime-age male joblessness, it's really the Eastern Heartland that's the most troubled part of America. That's the part of America in which there are great swaths of 1 in 4 prime-age males jobless. And I tend to think that joblessness is much more important than just straight financial inequality, because if you just look at the sort of human misery associated with being unemployed, it's just vastly more, particularly for men, because it's men who really do poorly at being and not having a formal job. Women who don't have formal jobs actually usually do something useful for society, whereas men tend to sit on their couches and watch television. And our sense of self comes from actually doing something with our lives and from social connection, both of which are lost when you're not working together. So this sort of the dysfunction of the Eastern Heartland was something that I worried a lot about. Whereas the Western Heartland had traditionally had higher joblessness, higher employment rates than the coast did. The wages weren't as high, but everything looked fairly healthy about the Western Heartland economies. So what do I think in terms of the COVID thing? Now, there's no question that rural areas are going to bounce back more easily. Many of them are still functioning. They don't need proximity. It's just a lot easier to deal with this. So they're going to be better off. But when I think about the sort of cities of the Eastern Heartland versus the cities of the coast, I actually wouldn't be at all surprised if the areas that end up paying the largest price are, the middle American cities of, Ohio, not Columbus, but Cleveland, Detroit, the Rust Belt cities are being particularly challenged, which both have density and have tough weather and don't have the sort of, economic muscle that San Francisco and New York have.
Right.
Or for that matter, that Houston has.
Right. It's just a matter of economic, I guess, dynamicism that in any economic downturn, you're saying these cities are generally hurt the worst, and therefore we can expect them to be hurt the worst again.
That's right. And it's they didn't have great demand for their labor to begin with. It's certainly not going to go up now. There's no question that there's going to be sort of a counter-urban thing that's going to come from this. I don't know how long it's going to last. Depends a lot on how strong the public health response is. Right. I mean, if this is a once-in-a-century pandemic, then I think in a couple of years, urban density comes back. If this is something that's going to reappear every 4 years, then a lot of Americans are going to be thinking quite seriously about what in the world they're doing living in an urban space going forward.
Right.
So a lot of it depends upon where that goes. But I think that sort of areas that are not particularly strong economically and high density are going to be particularly cursed.
So you're an economist, and you're pretty familiar, I'm sure, with the CARES packages that we have passed out of Congress, with the small business funding, the distressed industries funding, direct cash payments, increased benefits for unemployment insurance. What's your general take on that? I have my own criticisms of what I myself have voted for. It's not it's not how I would design it. Let's just be honest. But I had to vote for it. It was still better than the alternative, which was nothing. So that's politics for you. But if you got to design it perfectly, what would be the right way to keep our economy afloat? So what's good and bad about these packages?
It's awfully hard to know. So the bad thing is that, look, it's unbelievable what you did, right? And I want to make it clear, I would have voted for it too. In your position, it would have pained me all over. It would have paid me to vote for this thing, but I would have voted for it as well because it was the right thing to do in this absolutely crazy time. That being said, the idea that you're given $349 billion to banks with sort of to try and get out to small businesses with some sort of vague conditionality that isn't entirely clear about keeping your employees. I mean, just the whole thing is so mind-boggling that we're throwing out that kind of money. I mean, usually, look, I get upset about the waste of $10 billion, let alone the assuredly $50-100 billion that'll be wasted in this thing. The ability to target is very limited, but it's hard to know what you could possibly do in the short run that would have been better targeted. I mean, we just don't have the public capacity to figure out how to do sort of a targeting that's cleaner. So the thing that was obvious to me that was the right thing, you did this as well, was just to get people who were really on the front lines of this thing cash and cash quickly, right? So that small amounts of cash to people who are likely to be laid off from service sector jobs, that seems like a vital piece of insurance to make sure that we limit suffering. I mean, usually I'm not a big fan of universal basic income or unconditional cash transfers because I think it reduces the incentive to work. And because I think most of the time what we want to do is we want to have Americans who are trying to figure out a way to be productive on this planet. And so giving them handouts from the federal government for doing nothing isn't a great way to encourage that. During a pandemic, during a lockdown, you really don't want people to be trying to earn a buck. And so it's actually okay to give them cash. And so I think that was an absolutely fine and appropriate thing to do.
On that particular policy, I mean, the reason I wasn't really in favor of direct cash payments is because it's not enough money for people who really need it, and it's way too much money for people whose income hasn't changed. And but for obvious reasons, it's very difficult to target that. And it was hard enough to get those cash payments out. People still haven't gotten them in some cases. And that was without targeting it at all. I mean, there's some means testing, but that's about it. And so, there's just an honest debate to be had about that. But the other problem I had with it was, okay, we're giving people money, but in a stimulus like fashion, but we're also telling them they can't spend it. So this is, it's only so helpful.
So first of all, I think it was always a mistake to think of that cash as being about stimulus. That was not what we were doing, right? The right way to think about it is it was just simple insurance. And you're right, it could have been better targeted. I was in favor of doing more with ex post taxation of the money to target. So you give everybody the checks or everybody the checks who earned less than a certain amount last year, but then you basically have a clawback based on how much they earn next year.
Right.
So you can, I mean, which
is still possible, I guess.
It's still possible. It depends on how the IRS, what you guys tell the IRS to do in terms of treating that. The business money though is sort of mind-boggling because I mean, the first order thing is it made sure that whoever had a strong, enduring banking relationship was going to be first in line to get the cash. That was entirely predictable. Yeah. But those businesses that had the strong, enduring banking relationships were the ones that were least likely to actually be desperate to need it. So I'm not sure exactly how you fix that. It's not like there was a clever idea that my old advisors, Jose Schenkman and Arminio Fraga, the former finance minister for Brazil, had, which was using the credit card companies more as an extender of loans. So, all these small businesses which aren't particularly well banked still do accept credit cards. So at least that was a possibility. But I don't know. And the problem is we were never set up to do this. And usually it takes me 5 years to form an opinion on what the right policy is on something. And you're asking us to come up with something in a week. Right. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, it really was. This is my biggest problem with both the distressed industries one's a little bit different. They actually have to prove that they're distressed to a much greater extent. The small business one, you're absolutely right. And this is a problem we've all been bringing up, but to your other point, it's very difficult to actually put those parameters in place without slowing down the program to such an enormous extent that it doesn't work at all. And it continues to be a problem. I mean, basically the way I've been trying to solve that one is I publicly shame anybody who's taking that loan and they know they shouldn't be taking it. If your revenue, and I'm doing it right now because this podcast will go out and I'm not cutting this part out. If you are a business that is taking a loan and your revenue hasn't changed, shame on you. Shame on you. It's un-American. It's purely un-American. And there's businesses that didn't get the money because of you. So there you go. and I say the same thing about the $1,200 check. There's no way that we could figure out how to limit that just to the people who needed it. And if you're getting that and your income didn't change, you should be donating that money or immediately spending it on your local restaurant, immediately. Or maybe not all at once, but at least over the course of a week, because this is what we had to do. It was a true emergency. We pressed pause on the economy. We made people stay at home and stop functioning and stop producing, stop consuming. And, you've got to inject some capital into that economy to keep it slightly functional.
Actually, I want to put in a coda to your recommendation about spending for your local restaurant. It may make sense for you, instead of actually buying food right now, to buy yourself some gift cards so you can use it when this thing is over. So another way to get money to your local retailers.
Exactly. There's lots of ways, and throughout the country, it looks like we're opening up slowly but surely. Depends on the state you're in. That's the real way to solve the economic crisis is get people circulating money through the economy again. I want to move on to, I guess, more general conversations, not COVID-19 related. People are so sick of hearing about the coronavirus, but we have to talk about it anyway. But on housing, so millennials have a lot of complaints these days, and I am a millennial. I understand a lot of the complaints. I don't understand some of the complaints. Housing is a big one, and it seems to be a pretty understandable one. I think on a relative basis, housing certainly is more expensive for a millennial than a boomer. Can we talk about that, and what city policies work with respect to affordable housing and what doesn't? And also, are we expecting too much from this conversation? Meaning, we have more people in America than we did 30 years ago. Shouldn't it be obvious that housing would have to increase in price? I don't know. Let's talk about it.
Well, I don't think it's obvious that housing has to go up in price at all. I think that, in fact, housing could easily be good, like most of the ones that we consume, which we mass produce in a perfectly affordable fashion. We don't think that because Americans end up buying more computers or more TVs that the price of computers or TVs has to go up. Right. And I think it's the same thing is true about houses. Now, the one thing that is in relatively limited supply is land. But in fact, this fact is maybe 10 years old, so we need to be a little bit careful on it. But when I calculated this 10 years ago, I figured out that you could pretty much put the entire world into the states of Texas and Oklahoma on 10th-acre lots. So you just have no shortage of land in this country if you wanted to use it. Of course, the challenge is there are, particular metropolitan areas that have made it very difficult to build. It's not that, all of that's a public policy choice. There's a lot of water that surrounds the island of Manhattan, and that makes it more difficult to build. There are a lot of mountains that surround San Francisco, and that makes it more difficult to build. But a lot of the action is actually coming from local land use decisions that make it difficult to construct housing. New York City in the 1920s built 100,000 housing units a year. It was like Texas in those days. And, it was a state that, it was a city that remained affordable to ordinary people, just like most of Texas has remained affordable to ordinary people because they unleashed the private developers who mass produce housing. And that means that, a red state like Texas does a heck of a lot better job of actually dealing with providing affordable housing for lower or lower middle income people than blue states like Massachusetts or New York.
Yeah, and I point that out quite a bit, that if you're from San Francisco and you think capitalism has failed you because your rent is on average it's like $4,000. I mean it's just unbelievable. In Houston, I'm not sure what our average is, but it's much lower. We don't have zoning laws. It's much less restrictive to build. I talked to developers and who might develop in Texas and California, and they have to budget about 4 times more money to develop anything in California, and that's just based on the regulations. And so, I tell my fellow millennials, like, you are correct. Your housing situation sucks compared to what your parents had. That is a valid complaint to have, but you're overwhelmingly voting for the policies that make it harder to build more affordable housing, just so you know. And so there's actually a background to that.
It's absolutely true. I mean, you need to allow the developers to build if you're going to expect housing to be affordable. And it's one of the things that I worry about is that Texas has been this safe haven for people who wanted to find a good affordable house. I wrote this paper for something called City Journal, which is produced by the Manhattan Institute, maybe 13 years ago, called Houston, New York Has a Problem, which was basically comparing what life was like for an ordinary income American. I sort of imagined a household. One of them works as in sales. One of them maybe has a service sector job. And, if they lived in New York, they lived in, maybe if they were lucky, they managed to get something in Staten Island or some far off distance in Queens, or maybe had an hour and a half commute in from New Jersey, but their lives were terrible, right? And whereas in Houston, these same people with the same, maybe $10,000 less they'd be earning, but their lives were comparably great. And it was all coming down to the fact that you could afford a decent house in a place with a decent school district in Houston, and you just couldn't do so in New York.
So I want to give the counter argument to basically what I just said, because my point in saying what I just said and what you agree with is, listen, you have to let some development occur. You have to let some, vertical construction to occur, especially in a place like San Francisco. Compare San Diego to San Francisco. I lived in San Diego for 10 years. I know the rental market very, very well, and I know it hasn't changed a whole lot. Okay, in downtown San Diego, it has not changed a whole lot. Why is that? Because they keep building more vertical construction, more apartment buildings, and the supply has kept up with demand, and rent prices have not gone up significantly in a place like San Diego. And this is not a place that people don't want to live. Okay, I know that was a double negative, but you know what I mean. It's really nice in San Diego.
Absolutely, it's really nice in San Diego.
So there should be plenty of demand, plenty of people moving there. San Francisco, same thing. So what's the difference? San Francisco just limits like crazy what they can build. Here's my counter argument to my own point here. Why can't they limit that? Right, and so shouldn't it? And this was my point earlier too about shouldn't we expect prices to go up, even relatively speaking, as we get more people, because it's still a city. There's still a confined amount of space, which is why it's different, as you noted, from TV production or washing machine production. And at a certain point, if the residents of a city say we just don't want big buildings here, we don't want more people here, the traffic is already too much. What's wrong with that? I mean, and what do we do about it? Really, like, do we just let prices keep going up, or do we need to build more cities? Like, what do we do?
So you're right. So the localities frequently want to shut things down. I think that there should be limits on local sovereignty in certain areas. I don't think that every locality necessarily makes the right decisions for everyone. And so in this case, I certainly wouldn't bring the federal government involved in it. But I'm really okay with some state level rules that limit localities' ability to restrict everything. So in Massachusetts, we have something called Chapter 40B. And what 40B does is if you've basically got close to no affordable housing in your jurisdiction, then a developer is allowed to use a state level process, which has somewhat looser zoning rules on it. It's a bit of a get out of jail free card. I'm not advocating it as a perfect policy, but some degree of state level limitation on the local tendency to zone is not a terrible thing, in part because once you have a homeowners enclave, they've got no interest in promoting affordability. For them, affordability means that the value of their most important asset didn't go up. They're not taking into account every outsider who might potentially want to locate in the area. So I think having some degree of state pushback on this is not crazy, but it's certainly a tough fight politically.
And even if there is some state pushback, it's not going to change the overall structure of San Francisco all that much. And I guess the question is there is an upper limit. I mean, there has to be, right? Like, there's going to forever be people who want to live in Manhattan, and Manhattan just doesn't have any more space at a certain point. And then the question becomes, what do we even do about that? Our housing, or some people would advocate for rent control. Some people would advocate for, I don't even know. Housing is a right. I mean, you hear these statements thrown out there, and I'm not so sure there's a whole lot of intellectual, foundations thrown behind those statements. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I understand. When residents in San Francisco to a certain point say, listen, we just don't want any more people. Like, it's crowded. We don't want any more people. And that's just the way it is. And, do we need just to change how human migration is ongoing in the United States?
San Francisco, I'm looking it up right now. San Francisco's population density is hardly that extreme.
Yeah.
It's something like 17,000 per square mile. It's not like walking around San Francisco is so. That's about a fifth of what is it? It's relative to New York. It's a lot lower. So I think San Francisco could build a lot. I agree with you that no, it's slightly over half what New York's population density is. It's not that it's not impassable, but you're right. They're going to block it, and we need to have other policies as well. Obviously, even if you take some view of housing being a right, surely no one has a right to a house wherever they want to live. Right, that's sort of a ludicrous idea that I have a right to a home on Park Avenue in New York, or I have a right to a home in Beacon Hill. So if you think that everyone should have a right to a home, presumably that leads you to something like the National Section 8 Housing Voucher Program. And I can see upsides to that. I think, like most economists, I favor using more flexible forms of aid rather than going through housing. But it certainly doesn't lead you to thinking that you want, rights in particular cities. In the case of cities, the best case for sort of local housing vouchers is if the city's character somehow there benefits from some form of mixing of rich and poor. That's sort of and again, I think of this as being, it's in the same line as your bow to local sovereignty. If the city of New York or the state of New York wants to pay for its own vouchers to enable people to live in fancy areas of New York City because they think that that's good for New York City, then, they presumably have a right to do that.
Well, that's an interesting maybe topic of conversation. What do you think about that? What do you think in generally about Section 8 housing, how to integrate low-income housing, how to solve a homelessness problem? What are some of the best methods you've seen to tackle these issues?
So homelessness is difficult because it's connected to the mental health issue as well. There's a whole line of thought which has this sort of fixed housing first view of homelessness that is, getting more pushback now, and I wouldn't want to take a strong stance one way or the other on this. In Section 8 is, this was a Republican policy. This is a policy that, now Senator Romney's father implemented as Secretary of HUD during the Nixon administration. It certainly was a much more attractive policy than the large-scale federally built housing projects that preceded it. Much more flexible, much more, and it enables, at least in principle, parents with small kids who lack money to move into better neighborhoods. And I think that's the sort of biggest upside for this, as we've seen in families that received Section 8 housing vouchers in the experimental Moving to Opportunity program, that they were able to move towards areas with more upside, and the kids have done better subsequently. So I wouldn't, if I were pushing against federal housing programs, I certainly wouldn't be pushing against Section 8 housing vouchers. And I probably would be in favor of trying to figure out how to make them both more flexible so you can move them across areas, and more targeted towards parents with young children, because that's where they seem to do the most good. I also would, push back often on local attempts to create affordability, either by screwing up the housing market through rent controls, or by putting more and more restrictions on new construction. Often what we call sort of affordable housing requirements are basically a tax on new development. And you never make a product more affordable by taxing its supply. So you really don't want to be sort of making it more difficult to build. And if you are going to be charging people for the right to build, which makes sense under certain circumstances, then you want to think about where that money can be best spent. And at least, you have to stack up whatever money you're spending to give middle income or lower middle income New Yorkers access to these apartments with what you could do with that money if, let's say, went to pre-K programs for the most disadvantaged children. Yeah,
that lines up with what I hear about a lot, which is, the voucher system in the Section 8 voucher system, it makes a lot of sense. It also needs a lot more flexibility, and it does become this impediment to development because for some reason there's a lot of additional federal regulations put on anything that's going to be used as Section 8 housing, and it prevents building it in the first place. This is what I hear from developers quite often, and flexibility just always seems to work better. I would rather, again, this is a deep philosophical difference between the left and the right. I believe much more in giving somebody the responsibility to succeed and to fail. And so, if they need help, let's give them that voucher and give them that money. But trying to dictate to such an extreme degree how it's used, it always seems to backfire.
I certainly agree with that in spirit. I will say there's an added problem with all the housing regulation that goes on around this, which is that housing regulation emerged in the late 19th century where there were really issues about poor housing quality, of like failing to connect to the sewers, of rats in the home,
Yeah.
right? And all these things were perfectly reasonable to have building inspectors going around and making sure that you actually had, your toilet was connected to a sewer. Because if it's not, it's really a bad thing.
Right. That would be
Fast forward
bad.
to 2020, housing, like the physical housing stock, is just not the problem. This is not an issue, right? It's the problem. The reason why housing matters for poor kids is much often that they're in a terrible neighborhood without role models, without people that they can connect to, rather than something that's sort of obviously wrong with the home. So it's not just that we're regulating; we're like regulating the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point too. These regulations are based on an era where you might not actually be connected to sewage. That is a terrible thing. We would not want that. So, okay, I want to move on to infrastructure, because this is the next big thing that everybody wants to spend a ton of money on. And, we've been hearing it for years now. I remember when I first got elected, the big question was, Democrats took the House. What are you guys going to work on together? And everyone's like, just say infrastructure. And honestly, that's really, everybody said it. Nobody knew what they were talking about. I don't think anybody still knows what they're talking about with respect to infrastructure spending and what that looks like at the federal level. You are, I think you're also pretty skeptical about what a really effective infrastructure spending would actually look like. Not to say we don't need it in plenty of places.
Yep.
The question is, how do you do it? Who should pay for it? How should it be financed?
So I'm a big believer that most sensible infrastructure is paid for by its users. That in fact we have modern technology right now. There's absolutely no reason why people who live in the suburbs of Oklahoma City should be funding those people who fly in and out of Kennedy Airport in New York. Right, the average income of Kennedy people flying in and out of Kennedy is vastly higher than the national average. And there's just absolutely no reason why we can't have airports that are essentially funded entirely by their users. That can be by a private model, right? I mean, Heathrow works perfectly well, and it's a private model for London's airport. Or it could be a public model, but there's just no reason for this, or for many forms of infrastructure, to not have the users pay for it. Now, there are exceptions. So sometimes it's just really difficult to actually get the payment model working. Technology is making that less and less visible. But it's for city streets, for example, right? You in principle, especially with autonomous vehicles, you could put in some GPS-based charging thing all the time. That does feel awfully intrusive of privacy, though. So for those, maybe you need a bunch of local property taxes that are also paying for it. For highways, I don't see why you don't want people to pay for it either with tolls or gas taxes. So we should spend, and the federal government should perhaps help direct these programs. But I think for most things, except for the infrastructure that is really directly targeted towards disadvantaged Americans, you really want the federal government to be picking up very little of the bill relative to users.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And then it should be our responsibility to really prioritize better what kind of infrastructure programs are actually beneficial to the economy. If we're gonna claim that this is some big stimulus that's creating jobs, is that claim really based on reality? By the way, you hear it all the time. It's such a typical political line. We spend all this money on infrastructure and therefore it will create jobs. How true is that from an economist point of view?
It's the dust is still not fully settled on this. I will say that the variation that came from differences in spending over space, and there were pretty substantial differences because of the way that the ARA infrastructure, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act infrastructure money was spent. That money certainly doesn't show a huge job bang for buck. Maybe $100,000 per job, something like that. The work of my former student, now a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Andy Caron, looked at differences in highway spending, and there, again, very small employment effects that came from this. So it's not that it's nothing, but it's really not a great way to get people back to work, in part because there's sort of a myth which takes us back to the New Deal of all these, guys, and they were, of course, guys working by the side of the road with their pickaxes, right? So in 1936, building highways was a pretty labor-intensive activity. It's not anymore. It involves a lot of machines, and that's perfectly good, and that's not a problem with it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a particularly good way to, hire people who are less employed. I really think you go wrong unless you think about infrastructure as delivering value on its own merits, and I think that's true more generally in terms of policies, that we want to look at what the direct impact of this policy is, not the indirect effect on jobs.
Yeah.
So,
right. And Houston Ship Channel here, it would be a good example. We want to widen it and deepen it so that more ships can come through and more commerce can be delivered and trade can occur. I mean, that seems to have an obvious effect on jobs. I'm just not convinced that every infrastructure project people talk about has any kind of economic effect like that one would.
Absolutely, but I would have guessed in that case there's no reason why the firms that use that channel can't pay for it. That in fact it's
the federal
not a thing which I want to ask the federal government to tax distant people yet.
100%, and we should always be looking for those kind of solutions. In Texas, we tend to tend to go toward in that direction. It's definitely the right way to do it. But it's so, the incentives in politics are so and by the way, that is what's happening with Houston Ship Channel. The bigger problem is the federal government allowing it to happen because of permitting issues. So, that's a different conversation. But this just gets to the brokenness of our, is that a word? Who cares? Of our politics, which is the incentives, right? It's every member of Congress has such an incentive to try and get more and more of the pies just so they can buy off their voters with more promises or more money. And that's a harsh way to put it, but it is. It's buying off votes, and I truly see it that way. And I am constantly talk like this because I want the American people to push back against this notion that your best politician is the one who promises you the most stuff, and because that stuff does come from you or your children eventually. You're paying down that with debt, and there's this weird sense that like the federal government just has all this hidden money and benefits that if only we were nice enough, we would just give it to people. But that's just not what it is. Like it just turns out we're the only part of government that does deficit spending. Yep,
exactly. And you're right to push against that. I want to also highlight one other thing which you emphasized, right? That the federal government's problems around permitting is real. But I want to sort of highlight another permitting issue which I think is really central that I just want to lay out there. It is a shocking and appalling thing in this country that we regulate the entrepreneurship of poor people so much more strictly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of rich people.
Yeah.
Right. That if you want to start your internet phenomenon in a Harvard College dorm, you can do it before any regulator knows you've got 1 billion users. If you want to start your little grocery store nearby in Cambridge that sells milk products, you've got 15 permits to leap through. And that's part of the sort of sclerosis that's holding back America.
Yeah, and occupational licensing being another scourge on America. And this is not a whole lot we can do about this at the federal level except keep publicly shaming any municipalities that make it hard to do business. I wonder if that's going to be an outcome of this pandemic, because we're going to be like, oh my God, we are in an economic crisis. We are right now. And even if coronavirus just disappeared, it's not obvious that everybody just goes right back to their old ways of doing things. It's going to take a little bit of time. And I hope there's some space to just say, guys, just open up. I don't care how you do it. Just open up a business. You want to start a hair salon? Go start a hair. You know what? You don't need 1,000 hours to learn how to braid hair. Go ahead and braid that hair and take some money for it. We'll figure out the details later. I mean, that would be phenomenal if that's, and you know what? In Texas, we're kind of already doing that. One of the first things we did, guess what? Made alcohol delivery legal. I mean, that one's got
a blow for freedom right there.
Why was that ever illegal? Come on. It's a big boon to restaurants. But on this same line of on the same topic, I forgot to ask you about, but it is related to this because it's all about promising people more stuff. You wrote a Wall Street Journal, or maybe you were interviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and they wrote about you. But what's the name of that one? It was how boomer socialism led to Bernie Sanders. So explain what you mean by that. And as I went through that article, it does seem to be a bit based on the politics of promising people stuff.
I think that to the sort of starting point with that essay was that whatever that interview, which is based on a couple of lectures I've given for the Manhattan Institute over the years, the James Q. Wilson lecture, and I think the starting point for it is that the millennial disaffection with the status quo is kind of understandable. That I can push back a little bit and say, look, if you want to compare this with most of human existence, it's still pretty great. But for many of them, the housing is unaffordable. They're not seeing their incomes rise relative to their parents. For many of them, they've had, never really had a perfect recovery from the '07 recession. And so things seem bad, and capitalism doesn't seem to be delivering on its promise. Now, I actually don't think the problem is with capitalism. I think it's the problem with the way that American politics has worked over the last 30 years, where everyone has claimed that they're delivering capitalism, while at the same time they're delivering something very different from capitalism. But that's sort of my starting point for this, is trying to make the case that in fact we get it, like that there are lots of things where boomers look at the world, millennials look at the world and they think I'm getting screwed. And it's housing. It's also the way the federal government works. It's the vast amount of money for older Americans and less money for younger Americans. I think for many, in fact, the COVID lockdowns may end up feeling like that, because it's the benefits accrue largely to the old, the costs are paid largely by the young, which doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. But it does mean that once again, it's a cost we're imposing on the young that may indeed make them even more angry with the status quo. And so I was trying to explain why they shouldn't be interpreting this as being a failure of capitalism, but rather of a limit of the limits that the government has put on capitalism, the public choices that we've made, not the problems of the private system. Among those, of course, are the failure to build enough housing. So that's a fairly obvious one. The politics of this are that, we have incumbent homeowners who don't want to allow new housing. And so, they make it difficult to build. They're not taking into account the fact that, their kids are paying the price of that. We see incumbent hairdressers, incumbent people in all sorts of occupations who make it difficult to get licensing. And I see this as being in general sort of related to the ideas of Manker Olson, who sort of saw stable societies becoming taken over by their insiders, who then rigged the system against outsiders. By the way, there's some great facts about, the extent to which, let's say you were, 35 to 44-year-olds. If you were the median 35 to 44-year-old in 1983, you had $60,000 worth of housing wealth in modern dollars. Today, you have only $6,000 in housing wealth. So there's a big change in that. And, there's this general sense that America isn't as dynamic as it used to be. But the answer to that isn't less capitalism. The answer to that is more capitalism. The answer is more freedom, not less. And we need more empowerment of outsiders rather than insiders.
Yeah, I love that message. And I want to talk more about it. I'll say when I first read that headline, here's what I actually thought it meant, because this is something I talked about before. I have this belief, and you can totally disagree with it because you've been around a lot longer than I have, observing political trends. I have not, but I have a theory, and I'll just call it a theory, which is that my Democrat colleagues who advocated for more spending, more socialistic policies in years past, let's say Bill Clinton era, 80s, 90s, I believe they never really believed it full throttle. I believe that there was some political opportunism occurring where you can promise people more stuff and they'll vote for you, and then the mean Republicans will come stop you and basically, just dull those worst tendencies around the edges and slow the growth of government just enough so that we don't completely undermine our foundations of a free market economy. But I don't think they actually believed it. But I think that rhetoric eventually led to a belief in it. And I think we have true believing socialists now, whereas before we just didn't. And a part of that is because the Cold War was ongoing and socialism had been discredited to such an enormous extent. But you can't say that now. We have true believing socialists. Young people are likely to have a positive thing to say about socialism. They're also likely to say they don't want the government telling them what to do. So, where does that leave us? And that's what I thought you meant. Now, what you really did mean, what you did write about, I also fully agree with, and I have a lot of opinions on. I think millennials do have a lot to complain about, and rightfully so. We are considered like this big complaining generation, and sometimes that is true. But also, like we just talked about, housing really is more expensive relative to our parents. Yep. It just is. Now, The question is, what do we do about that? Healthcare is clearly more expensive than it used to be. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and that's another podcast, everybody, just for later this week. We don't have time to get into it on this one. College tuition relative to our parents, it is clearly more expensive. The problem is, what are we voting for as millennials in order to fix these things? Because as it turns out, millennials are overwhelmingly voting for things against them. Let me give you a great example. Social Security 2100. Okay, that's a piece of legislation that dramatically, and well, I don't know if dramatically, but it increases across the board Social Security benefit payments and increases payroll taxes to do it. Okay, and totally removes the cap on those. So, because right now you're only taxed up to, I think it's about $130,000 a year for your payroll taxes. So what does that really mean? It means a direct transfer of payments from the young to the old, a direct transfer. And yet this is what millennials are voting for. And I have to remind people of that all the time. And you also write about, like, listen, millennials have seen these sort of injustices occur. And because of that, there's been this like reaction to the system, which has led to Bernie Sanders, who's like, okay, well, I'm going to give you your shake too. Free housing, free education, all that. Because if the boomer generation gets it, these, what I would consider, pretty good benefits in retirement, then we should get it too. And now, of course, the question is, how sustainable is this?
It's not sustainable, and it comes at a huge cost on American dynamism. And the right answer is not that, the young should get more free handouts, but we should restrict the handouts that are foolishly given to other people. And we need to have just a more responsible view of that. And just to be, I want to just throw out a couple of political ideas. So one thing, I agree with everything that you said about the tax and spend side of the aisle, but it is also true that the GOP side on the aisle did too much tax cutting without associated spending cutting. Yeah. Right. And that's a way of pushing things off for the next generation as well. And I think, the people who don't need to get elected, like me, have to be against both of them. Right. I'm in favor of tax cuts, but I want those things to be matched by spending cuts.
Totally
I think another
agree.
thing
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on. Yeah. No.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm one of those people who says, guys, I want to have a real conversation about Social Security and Medicare, and I think my generation should have to give something to that too. Namely, my retirement age has to be later. Like, I'm going to live longer. Look at all these cool supplements now that we have, to make us live longer. I mean, there's no case that I should be retiring in my 60s, and we don't have to take away the benefits of the baby boomers. Of course, we're accused of that anytime we have a reasonable conversation about this, but that's not the case.
You are so right. You are so right. You do not need to screw anyone who's over the age of 65 or over the age of 60 right now. You just need to have a later retirement age phasing in over time, which is just, how could that not be the right thing to do? Yeah,
we did it in the 80s, and it actually is still getting phased in now, I believe, or it might have just ended. But it needs to keep going. That goes without saying. That should be what millennials have to give up, right? We should expect to retire later, but do not raise my tax. My taxes are high enough, and to an extent, that's an ethics conversation. How much should the government be taking from people? And the different philosophies will have different answers to that. I obviously come down on less taxes is better, but Republicans have failed to reduce the spending. They claim they want to, and there's political reasons they just couldn't. And I tell my voters, I'm like, guys, we all have to be in this together. This is an American cultural problem, right? It's, because even Republican voters will say, well, you didn't reduce spending. I'm like, okay, fine. This is the spending we have to reduce. No, not that spending. It's like, well,
that's right.
Come on.
That's right.
So, but I interrupted you. What were you going to move on to?
No, I was also going to say that the dynamism. So let me throw out an idea, which is a little bit far-fetched, but we know that the federal government really doesn't have the ability to rewrite local zoning codes or to rewrite local employment regulations. It just doesn't work from Washington. That's got to be handled at the local level, maybe with a bit of state intervention. But I'm not averse to having a few conversations, maybe said loudly, about how we should make, Department of Transportation highway funds to states contingent upon less onerous zoning regulations near new highway building, or various other forms of economic aid contingent upon making it easier to get new permits. Now, to be clear, I don't actually want a federal bureaucracy that will that will mandate that or control that. I just want you to say it once in a while, so you get, in state legislatures, someone who's a friend of the cause of freedom to say, oh, we're going to lose our transportation money unless we actually get our act together and make this reform. So I think it's okay to talk about that stuff, even if I get a little bit afraid about actually having the feds implementing it.
Yeah, because always be careful what you wish for in federal government, adding even more restrictions and mandates to the money. But at the same time, what you're pointing out is there is a cultural movement that needs to happen towards less or more freedom. I mean, less regulation and more freedom, and how that benefits.
Absolutely. And we want to make it as easy as possible for millennials to start new businesses, especially when this pandemic is over.
Right.
And if localities are making it difficult to do that, that needs to be pushed back on.
It absolutely should. More freedom is better. I think that's the. It doesn't mean things are perfect, but this is humanity we're talking about. I think too many Americans believe in this sort of perfectly regulated utopia that has been sold to them by politicians, and it's a dishonest sales pitch. It really is, and I think the end result is people becoming resentful and angry because that promised utopia, it never really arrives because it can't arrive, at least not in the way that it's being presented to people. And I think we need to understand that and express that a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Dr. Glaeser, is there anything else you want to add? That was a great conversation.
No, it's been great fun, Representative Crenshaw. Thank you. And thank you so much for your service to our country.
Oh, and thank you so much for your service. I mean, teaching America's future generations is an incredible task. So we appreciate it.
It is a great honor, but it's a lot easier than being shot at. So, or going into a coal mine for that matter. So. Oh man,
I don't know. These days in college campuses, I mean, they're not shooting at you, but they are. They can get a little upset.
There's a bit of that.
I'm still in combat in many ways. It hasn't really changed. I miss my old combat quite a bit. At least I knew who was shooting.